Turning our attention to budget news now. This year, the state legislature and governor didn't just pass an on-time budget. They did it without including what Capitol insiders call one-shots, which are basically gimmicks to put revenue into the budget for 1 year. Today, Comptroller DiNapoli proposed a new plan that would make sure the state legislature doesn't go back to its old ways. He says his plan would also reform the budget process to make it more transparent. And the Comptroller is joining me in studio tonight to talk more about this plan. Thanks for joining me, Comptroller.
Erin, good to be with you.
So give us a rundown of some of the changes that you'd like to see made in the budget process.
Well, I certainly think, as you laid out, we had a good year in terms of the process this year, and that the budget was done on time without the reliance on the fiscal gimmicks that we've seen in the recent past. The challenge now is how do we be sure that that's what we're going to have moving forward. So I've laid out a strategy for fiscal reform that includes many elements that I think will help ensure that we'll have a smooth process moving forward. I think we need to identify on a multi-year basis not only budget gaps, but early on how we're going to fill those gaps so everybody has some idea about what the solutions are going to be and the gap closing strategies will be. I also think we need to have a strengthened revenue forecasting process, put more teeth into it than what we have right now. I think we need to do a better job of managing the debt side of the equation. We need to have a more clearly focused strategy as far as how we're going to invest in our capital assets. We need to require public negotiation of budgets through the conference committee process. We saw that started once again, and I think that was helpful to the resolution this year. There are some other elements in it, but it really is an attempt to say what is it that we need to do structurally. Some of this would require change in statute, some would actually require change in the state constitution, but how can we be sure we have the right kind of ground rules so we have an efficient and productive budget process, not just in 2011, but as we move forward as well.
And this isn't too far removed from what it seems like the governor is trying to do. I mean, in this budget, they put a spending cap basically on education and health care spending over 2 years, so they already know what they're going to spend next year. So have you spoken to the governor? Is he on board with your plan?
Certainly that part of his strategy is exactly what I think we need to encourage across the board. You need multi-year budgeting, and you've had some proposals for fiscal reform in the legislature. I know Senator Liz Krueger in the Senate has had this proposal pending for a couple of years now. At least if you start to focus the budget process on a long-term strategy instead of the kind of short-term decision-making that we've had in the past, that's how you can have localities and stakeholders, whether they're not-for-profits or hospitals or those that depend on state funding, at least they can start to plan ahead of time instead of going budget by budget, and too often it's been late budget by late budget and mid-year cuts and all that. If you have multi-year budgeting, not only for education and health care, as you point out that we have this year, but do it across the board, understanding that in the second year you may have an opportunity to fine-tune it, but at least if you start to set out the parameters, I think it will help us move from crisis management to the kind of thoughtful long-term strategies that we haven't had. The other piece that I think we need to include as well is a move to gap accounting, because if we do that, we will look more clearly at exactly what the long-term obligations are of the funding decisions that are being made. So multi-year budgeting, moving to gap accounting, and the other elements of reform that I've suggested will help to institutionalize the very positive changes we've seen in 2011.
What do you envision for open budget negotiations? Because many insiders in Albany argue that you can't have candid budget talks without putting the whole process in jeopardy, and scrutiny of the public, which could delay things from getting done, basically.
Well, I do think there'll always be an element of discussion at a staff level and discrete conversations, that I don't think that would ever be eliminated. But there was a time when I served on the legislature that I was part of the conference committee process, and there are a couple of benefits of it. First of all, when you have the conference committee process, even if not everything is being negotiated at that table, much is being discussed and some is being negotiated in a public forum. So the press and to the extent that the public can be there, there's more openness about what's on the table, what are people looking at. The other part of having the conference committee process is that you involve rank and file legislators. One of the things that's always very frustrating, you hear from New York citizens all the time, well, I elect my assembly representative, I elect my senator, but do they have anything to do with the process? Is it all up to the leaders? Well, when you have a conference committee process, you have rank and file members involved, Republicans, Democrats, majority, minority, both houses, they're more involved in the process. They have something invested in the decision making. And I saw how that really made it more of a grassroots effort in terms of those who are elected by the people to represent them in the budget negotiations actually have a seat at the table. So will there still be some level of negotiation separate from that? Absolutely. But I think a broad range of conference committees involving as many rank and file legislators as possible is preferable to what we have too often, which is, the old story of the three men in the room making the decisions. Again, there'll always be some level of leadership sign off on what's going on, but I do think the more you can engage rank and file members, especially through a conference committee process, the more information will be out there and the more that the representatives who are elected by the public will be part of the process.
One more question on the budget, the current budget that's enacted. You have a lot of good things to say about it, but after the budget was passed, you released a press release and you kind of said or seemed to criticize the severe pain that this budget could possibly cause for school districts and healthcare providers, and I was wondering if you thought this was a good budget overall.
Well, I felt that the parameters that the governor laid out for the budget from the start was absolutely the right direction. And I think to the extent that this budget stayed within those parameters, it absolutely is a recognition of the fiscal realities of what we're faced with, still feeling the effects of the recession and the state having diminished revenues. We don't have the money to do everything we'd like to do. What I did say, though, is that we should not have any point of view other than the fact that this is a painful budget and a tough budget. And there will be implications in terms of local governments, in terms of not-for-profits, in terms of hospitals. And I think the first wave of that you're going to see in the many districts school districts across our state now that are going to have their budget votes coming up in a couple of weeks in May. They're starting to finalize their budgets now, and you're seeing in certain communities, the teachers, other staff members are being laid off. Taxes are going up. Less state aid came than some districts anticipated. All that is having an impact. So there is a reality to what we have to face, and for many school districts, particularly, some of them have reserves or undesignated fund balances that will help them through this year, but we're going to have some of the same tough choices to make next year. So it really is important that we be sure that we're not wasting taxpayer resources during this tough time. And we all need, and some of this obviously involves help from Washington in terms of the economy, we need this economy to pick up again. We need the revenues to be coming to the state again. Another report that we put out showed that going back to the estimates that this past year's budget were based on, our revenue was off from what was initially projected. So we're still in a very difficult fiscal climate in terms of the revenue picture for the state. Too many people aren't working. Unemployment is too high. We need that recovery to kick in.
I'd like to switch gears a little bit. About a year ago, the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico took place, and you decided shortly after to file a lawsuit against BP for the losses that caused to the state's retirement fund. Wondering if you could give us an update on where things stand with that right now.
Well, as you point out, a year ago we had this terrible disaster, environmental and economic disaster in the Gulf, and the BP spill had consequences that were far-ranging, including an impact on our New York pension fund. We're an investor. We're invested very, very broadly. We're a $140 billion fund, so we have investments in many different companies. BP is a place where we're a shareholder. And we saw the value of our shares go down by about 50%, and that was typical for other shareholders as well. So our interest was in recovering our losses to make the pension fund whole. That's the pension fund that provides retirement benefits for our state and local retirees, and taxpayers have an interest in seeing that the fund is well funded. And we applied for lead plaintiff status as part of the class action suits that were pending against BP. The update is that the courts have designated New York and Ohio as well, the Ohio pension funds, as the co-lead plaintiffs in this action. So I'm very pleased that the courts recognize that we had a loss and that we were in a strong position to do what's required when you're a lead plaintiff. So we are now going through the preliminaries of that process of the court proceeding. I can't tell you how long it's going to take. These things typically take a period of time. Sometimes they're settled in court. Sometimes there's a negotiated settlement. But we had 19 million shares at the time of the disaster, and we had a significant loss. We want to recover that loss for New York State's pension fund, and we want BP to be a better corporate citizen. We think they took unnecessary risks. They misrepresented how they were adhering to safety protocols. We want to see a change in that corporate decision-making, in that corporate level of responsibility. So we want to get money back for the pension fund and have BP be a much better corporate citizen.
And we'll certainly be paying attention to that. There was an article today in the New York Times that seemingly sympathizes with Lieutenant Governor Richard Ravitch. He was basically put in place when former Governor David Patterson was took over after the Spitzer scandal and did not accept the salary that comes with that position. But your office did ask him to pay more than $700 in taxes. Why? Were you being extra careful there?
Well, in this environment, we all have to be extra careful. Dick Ravitch is a great New Yorker, and he did a great job as lieutenant governor under some very, very difficult circumstances. And much to his credit, and he was in a position to offer this, he was willing to serve the public as lieutenant governor and not take any salary. Of course, there are other aspects that go with the position, and part of that included use of a vehicle, and there is some liability there. So, as the article indicated, former Governor Lieutenant Ravitch, of course, being the good citizen that he is, wanted to be sure that he was complying with the rules and the requirements. And I think the tone of the article was no good deed goes unpunished, but I know for Richard Ravitch, the opportunity to serve the people of New York as Lieutenant Governor was paramount, and I don't think the $700 means a lot to him one way or the other.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you so much, Comptroller, for taking the time out to chat with us today. Comptroller Tom DiNapoli, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Aaron. Thank you.